You are listening to Proof Text, a Glossa House podcast exploring Scripture and all things related to it. New episodes are released daily. For more information, check out glossahouse.com and subscribe to our channels on Spotify and YouTube. Welcome and enjoy.
Hello and welcome to Proof Text and Glossa House TV. I'm Michael Halcomb, and today I have the great privilege of talking with an old college buddy, my friend Zac Parsons. So Zac, welcome to the show.
I'm trying not to take the word old, too personally.
Yeah. Well, we're getting up there. You still look good, man. You actually don't look like you've changed much.
I
got all this. Dude, you don't got the white in the beard. You got a little
real
bit
close. I got a few. I'm keeping it pretty tight these days, but those are wisdom marks, man.
Yeah, look at that, dude. It's like all white. It's yeah. But that's what happens after years of PhD work and ministry and all that stuff. So, Zac, tell us just a little bit about where are you? We're gonna hear your story, but just kind of give us a preview of coming attraction. Like, where are you? Where do you live? And what's this room you're in? This space that you're in?
Yeah, it is kind of an interesting space. We were talking about that before we hit record. So I'm actually in a town called Evansville, Indiana right now. Yeah. And if you're thinking, oh yeah, I've heard of Evansville, it is not that town outside of Chicago. It's actually in the southwestern part of Indiana, just across the river from Kentucky. And I've lived here for about 15 years now. And my wife and I own what's now sort of like a growing chain, I guess, of coffee shops. We have 4 coffee shops in the Evansville area. Wow. And this most recent one that we built, we acquired a building that was previously a hair salon academy where they would train people, how to cut and perm and style and dye hair. And as part of sort of the remnants of acquiring that space and turning it into a coffee shop, I hung on to a couple of the perm chairs that they had there. So I have turned that into my podcast in-person guest studio.
Great. Yeah.
And then you can see Ted Lasso back there. That was a gift from one of our employees who I recommended the show to her. She fell in love with it and then gifted me that. And it's kind of been a mascot for us. And the plus sign is a remnant from one of our coffee shops that failed. So that kind of a reminder of, not everything, works out, but you can still, take, some of the lessons learned from it. And I don't know what's up with these glowing hexagons. I thought they looked cool at Best Buy. And they just add a little panache to the whole setup as well.
You got an Air Jordan box down there too. Huh?
Yeah. So let me scan down. There you go. There's the Jordan box. So when I opened up my YouTube channel, this is weird. This will be a good place to kick it off. Once we opened up this location last year in the fall of 2023, that was the second straight year that we had opened up a new location, and we were a little exhausted. Our team was definitely exhausted, and so we kind of made a deal with them that we wouldn't open up another location in 2024. So it was like, we were going at such a breakneck speed and doing these new things with new locations. What am I going to do? And I remember thinking, I need a new mountain to climb. And I'd done a podcast previously during the pandemic, like when it was like, we can't do coffee anymore. We can't do a lot of life, but I've got a computer, I've got a microphone, we can talk to people on Zoom. And so there was a little bit of that itch that was still maybe wanting to be scratched. And when I turned on the mic and the camera to record for the first time, I tried to get into a space to where I could sort of tap into something inside of me and just be as honest as I could. And what came out was a realization about how in my spiritual and personal and church journey, I just called it a church journey. In my spiritual journey and life, I have always still been very fascinated by and interested in the church and God. And I've had seasons of my life where I was an ordained minister. I've had seasons of my life where I was an avowed atheist. And I kind of find myself, in middle age. I'm in my mid 40s now. My kids are getting older. And wanting to discuss that further again and wondering if maybe there was a baby in that bathwater
Mm,
in my church experience, and which makes perfect sense to be talking to someone like you, to where we've shared those experiences in church life a couple decades ago, and where you've grown since then. It'd be great to kind of catch up and hear
yeah.
why it's been so fascinating and life-giving for you as well.
Yeah, church the church journey, if we want to use that term, hasn't always been life-giving.
Hmm.
It's at times been very painful and um suck the life out of you.
Hmm.
And it hasn't always been that. Even right now, the season that I'm in, the season I've been in the last 11 months, the denomination that I'm a part of and the district that I'm in, where I pastor, has been going through absolute turmoil.
Hmm.
And I've kind of, in a way, found myself right in the center of some of this turmoil. And it's been very lonely at times, very depressing, very discouraging. And there have been days where I've felt like I've wanted nothing more than to just walk.
Hmm.
Yeah. Um, and so, yeah, it has been life giving at points. But it's also been, it's also required a lot from me.
Sure. Well, and there's that idea too of like there's your church context and the experiences that you have had, and then just the big C church and the
Yeah.
idea of church, or the idea of God and Jesus and what a
Mm,
relationship with God might look like, and
yeah.
how you have held that in your life at these different stages, and there is a little bit of a different experience when your vocation is tied to it. And
No, that's
I
true.
definitely found that for myself, to where I was able to explore things at a different level when I stopped being a pastor.
Mm,
But yet, whatever that sort of instinct towards being a pastor or being a minister, whatever that was, it still tended to sort of come out in these secular contexts.
yeah.
So just curiosity about how even the coffee shop, it's like,
Yeah.
it's not a Christian coffee shop, but a lot of people sort of treat it with that reverence of a third space, and
Mm,
um, they do sort of elevate their conversations in a lot of ways. It can be a type of special occasion or a space for inspiration. And we have, the name of our coffee shop is Honeymoon, and my wife and I run it together. And so there is this sort of kind of romantic partnering element to
mm,
it that I think draws about a certain energy as well.
yeah.
But yeah, how we hold that as part of our identity, having vocations, being men, being fathers, um, and what Jesus might mean, and all of it is still something that I'm really fascinated by.
Yeah, and I've been sort of like just from the periphery, kind of keeping up with some of your journey. And we went to, so for people watching, listening, Zach and I went to Bible college together. We played college soccer together, and played lots of games of Dirty Uno on the soccer bus with
Yes.
with our with our college buddies as we were going to games and whatnot. But so we were in Bible. Dirty Uno, by the way, is not a dirty thing for those of you. It just means you cheat while you're playing Uno, essentially. But so we went to Bible college together, and then there have been these sort of touch points where you and I have connected. When I did the TEDx thing in Evansville, we
Yeah.
sort of reconnected. You were out in Hawaii with your wife not too long ago. We reconnected, but I
Yeah.
started been able to follow some of your journey, um, and over the years. And so let's just like go back early. Were you raised in a church family? Was that a
Yeah.
church context? Yeah.
Yeah. My parents, they got married in 1972, and I was born in 1980. So they had a good sort of, almost decade together, is sort of establishing themselves as a couple. And I think within that time in their 20s, they sort of found the church and sort of took it more seriously as a couple. And I was the firstborn, and my brother was born a couple years after that. They took us to church all the time. It was fairly important in our lives. We attended regularly. But I would say in middle school for me is when it started to become a lot more serious and became a personal, more meaningful personal faith for me. And it kind of sprang from the context that I was in a town called Mesa, Arizona, which is a
Okay.
suburb of Phoenix. And it was an area that was founded by Mormons in the 1800s, and still retains a pretty predominant, at least at that time in the early 90s, like a pretty predominant Mormon population. Probably about 65% of my middle school would be Mormon.
Wow.
And so I sort of started to realize that maybe I was not the same as them. When people's sort of social groups get sort of sussed out, in sixth, seventh, and eighth grade, I realized, wow, I'm kind of an outsider here. I realized that we shared a same, sacred book. So I was in a non-denominational Christian church, Bible believing church, and my Mormon friends also believed in the Bible. And so biblical debates began to be a part of what really interested me. And so I would read
Mm,
my Bible with the intent of having something to debate theology, with my Mormon friends. And
nice.
for several months, it was great and entertaining, and you can imagine, the zeal of a young man who finds something that he's interested in and good at. But then one day, reading through my Bible in a church setting and during a sermon, wasn't paying attention to the sermon. I'm looking for text that I can use as ammunition. I came across Matthew 7:3, where it said, "How can you judge the speck of sawdust in your brother's eye when you have a plank in your own eye?"
Mm,
And I wasn't like a party kid. Like there were kids that were doing worse stuff than me, but I wasn't perfect. I wasn't an angel.
yeah.
And there was enough in my life that I knew that was wrong, that was sinful, that was not godly, to where I did have a plank in my own eye. And in that moment, kind of realized that I actually wanted to experience this God that I'd been sort of kind of talking around and utilizing in just a completely different level than at a personal soul spiritual place. And everything kind of changed after that, and it kind of went through those steps of really being all in as a Christian. And when it became time to choose a vocation, being a pastor and going to Bible college was the clear step for me.
Okay. Wow. So you went from Arizona to Kentucky.
Yeah,
Um,
they
what
gave
was
me
the
a scholarship just based on being from Arizona. Like they had a quota of like Arizona people.
okay?
And Phil Daly, who we played, or we ended up playing soccer together, but he and I got the two Arizona like scholarship
Okay.
offers, and so
All
I
right.
sort of took that as my sign from God that this was the place to go.
Okay. So you were in this church service poking around in scripture, and uh you had this sort of come to Jesus moment.
Sure.
Eventually you head off to Bible college. Now when we were in college together, uh we everyone who came through the door sort of had to at least have a major in Bible or a minor in Bible,
Yeah.
right? And then did you major in ministry?
So I think I want to say it was a double major. It may have shifted to a minor at some point, but I want to say that it was a double major. I had a major in Bible and preaching. That was what
Yeah,
I landed on, that sort of path.
yeah. All right, yeah, that makes sense. I just interviewed Dave Fennessy, Dr. Dave
Oh
Fennessy,
yeah.
by the way. So
Oh, I
that
can't
would
wait to
be
see that.
yeah. And I get that college magazine, they send out.
Yeah, The
I can't
Voice.
The Voice, yeah, yeah. And I just saw that they're bringing that minor thing back, the Bible minor.
Oh,
So
okay.
the year after I graduated, they did away with it. and now they're bringing it back. But he was kind of saying, well, that's a good thing, but also lamenting it, because now that means, for the classes that he teaches, he'll end up with a bunch of students in there who don't want to be in there, right? So he
I can
he
see
likes
that.
having these Bible classes with students who, that's their major and they want to be there. But anyway, so you're at Bible college. What's that like for you? I know what it was like for me. What was it like for you?
Bible college was incredible for me because whereas I was not very popular, not very like I was an outsider, right? Like I was in this sort of minority position, except at youth group, we had a rather large church and youth group, and I had a great group of friends, and there was just like this sort of acceptance there. And then just the size difference going from graduating class of, I don't know, like 900 people at my high school to
Wow.
a student body of about 500 at Kentucky Christian. And we, I think it was like the welcome weekend. I was wearing like a really loud shirt. I tend to wear kind of loud shirts like this. And it was like, all right, we got to vote for a student council president. And like somebody said, hey, that guy with the red and blue shirt, like let's put him in the mix. And I won. Like, and I didn't know anybody, but I think just having that weird shirt got me there. I was like, wow, am I accepted here? And it changed a lot of things for me in terms of what people would maybe put onto me as a potential leader. And so that developed over time to where when I would see opportunities to lead, I would respond to them more readily than I ever had before. So that was a really great social aspect of it for me. I loved the fact that we had a curfew. I loved the fact that there weren't girls allowed in the dorms. I loved the fact there was no alcohol. Like, these were the rules. Whether or not everyone kept those rules, is maybe a different story. But
Right.
those things were great for me. That was the experience that I really sort of wanted to have. I wanted to be in that Christian context. However, interestingly, sort of academically slash biblically, spiritually, it was at Bible college to where some of my theology really started to change. And like a lot of people, when you're in your late teens, early 20s, the world can seem kind of black and white. You got stuff figured out. You know what's up. And then all of a sudden you live some life, you meet some people from different perspectives, or you just learn some things that I didn't realize there were so many more perspectives on the Bible than mine, naively, embarrassingly. I didn't understand things about the original languages. It never actually occurred to me that English didn't exist when Jesus lived. Like this, the way that I think in English and the way that Jesus, spoke in Aramaic or Hebrew, which was then written down in Greek, like that sort of telephone game of like how I'm reading this scripture in English, and maybe it's the NIV, or you can take even all the different English versions. Just all of that really forced me to take a lot of my black and white beliefs and say, maybe it needs to be a little more shades of gray, and maybe I need to have a little more grace with some of these things that I was pretty sure I understood. And that sort of unsettling of that sort of foundation of the Bible, which was really sort of the core of the church tradition that I grew up in, that sort of kind of led me down a path, which I'm sure we'll get to the rest of that here, shortly.
Yeah. So when you graduated Bible college, I'll back up. And if we want to edit this out, we can edit this out. But I remember, one of the shocking moments at college that involved you was your senior sermon. I think it was your
Oh
senior
yeah.
chapel
Oh
sermon.
yeah.
And we don't have to go into details about that, but I remember sort of just the shock that surrounded that, and you got up essentially in front of everybody, students, professors, the like, and offered up a confession of
Yeah.
sorts. And
Yeah, we can talk about it. It's been 20 years. I've been divorced since then. I mean, it's
Yeah.
People are probably wondering, what is this confession? I'm actually kind of touched that you remember it.
Well, I remember just that sending some shockwaves through the small community, um, but also just the rawness of all that. Yeah. Um, and certainly you weren't the only one on campus there with those kinds of struggles, right? So
Yeah.
I think you're probably speaking for a lot of people in some way or another. But yeah, so if you want to share some of that,
Sure, sure.
you can.
If,
Yeah,
if if you're wondering what this confession was, no, I did not kill somebody, but we did have. So actually, it might be interesting to tell the whole story because
yeah.
I never had a struggle with pornography. Actually, never had exposure, not real exposure to pornography until I went to Bible college. And the way that I remember this is that Channel 18 was MTV. Okay. And at this time, MTV was the devil. And it had terrible shows like Beavis and Butthead on it and Total Request Live, which would show music videos of scantily clad women, among other things. And so the school, in its great wisdom, decided to buy a filtering tool that would sort of create a filter around channel 18, which had the unintended effect of sort of mostly unfiltering channel 19, which was Cinemax, also known as Skinemax. And so all of a sudden, and after 10 p.m., Cinemax would show these TNA movies, for lack of a better term, like just it wasn't scantily clad women, it was not clad women. And all of a sudden we have this curfew at 11 o'clock, and on your TV almost every night you have the potential, if you felt tempted, which many of us
Mm,
did, to watch that. And so that was my first exposure to something like pornography. And this would have been, late 90s, early 2000s, toward the internet's becoming more
mhm,
ubiquitous. Everyone has it. And so then pretty soon you figure out, oh, there are websites that also have this. And by my senior sermon, I had actually gotten married and assumed that once, I was, having sex, that would go away.
right.
And it didn't. And so,
Mhm,
yeah, it really felt like I couldn't give a true message of how God had changed my life, and how it encourage others to seek Him if I wasn't being completely honest.
mm. Well, that's something I've always appreciated about you. Is your willingness to just put yourself out there. And it's pretty risky, right? It takes vulnerability to do that. To get up in front of a room full of professors and students and to tell that truth, which probably made a lot of the young men, maybe some of the young women in there, maybe some of the professors sweat. Um, you know, um,
Maybe,
but
and maybe they
even just
lost respect for me a little bit, and that's
right.
it's you said risk, but for me it is kind of a risk reward kind of thing. Like if you can
Mm,
if you can maintain relationships with people that are actually based on the truth, or
right.
as close to as what you can actually portray appropriately. And I've actually learned over time that there's ways that kind of disclosure is inappropriate. Like it's not sort of
Right.
a, hey, you just get to spill your guts whenever you want, wherever you want, and if
Yeah.
somebody's offended, that's their problem. I've definitely learned that there's a time and a place for that level of disclosure. But when you do disclose your true self with people, you can trust better what comes back to you, and
Mm,
honestly, sort of expect a reciprocity. And one of the definitions of leadership that really has stuck with me is the idea of leaders go first. And
mm,
so, if you feel the call to be a leader, you really can't expect something from someone else that you're not going to do first.
mm, mm. So after Bible college, did you you went into ministry, like formal
Yeah.
ministry for a while?
Yeah. I
S-
did a weekend ministry um, during my senior year of college, and then went into a full-time ministry in suburban Detroit in this would have been the fall of 2003. I
hmm,
remember it was the same time that the movie 8 Mile came out, and I lived on one side of 8 Mile and worked. My church was on the other. Um,
hmm,
it was in a more like middle class area of
wow.
suburban Detroit than what was depicted in that film, but that song was everywhere. Kind of place it in
Yeah.
time for people. But yeah, I was the youth and children's minister for about a year and some change. We went through a process. I was kind of the missing piece in a strategic growth approach for that church. They had a senior pastor who'd been there for about a dozen years, an associate pastor who'd been there for maybe 5 years. And it was like, if we can get this sort of youth and family pastor in here, then that's the missing piece. And so that kicked off a close to a year long sort of praying and visioning session with our elders. We had about a dozen elders trying to figure out, where is God wanting to lead this congregation? And by that end of that year or so, it became clear to all of us, except for the senior pastor was feeling something a little different, that we needed to go in a more outreach focused way and change some things. And when we realized the senior pastor wasn't feeling the same thing, hearing the same thing, we wondered if maybe he was being called somewhere else.
Hmm.
It turned into a situation to where, when the eldership asked the senior pastor if he was feeling, being called somewhere else, and if not, then maybe he needed to step down. They just weren't on the same page. That announcement to the church was actually not given by the senior pastor, but by the chairman of the elders. And so we had
Wow.
this Sunday, and I actually preached that Sunday before it happened, to where, no, excuse me, I preached the next Sunday. All hell broke loose.
Yeah.
And the leader of the elders, once they kind of got to the part of the letter, and the congregation kind of got wind of what was happening, this guy stood up and said, "Are you firing him?" And it was like this sort of shouting back and forth, and there was just an electric energy in the air of just
Hmm.
that tension of like, is this about to get violent? Like, yelling is happening, our fists going to fly.
Hmm.
What is happening? So a little bit more of that kind of happened, and then it's chaos. I go downstairs and I try and tell all my youth and kids, like, hey, something just happened here. Um, your parents will talk to you about it, but I know you guys are kind of wild and rowdy, but maybe tone it down, because they're about to have a serious conversation with you. I remember this moment, just talking about with my wife earlier this week. There was a 5-year-old girl who would always kind of give me a high five on her way out of church. And just like clockwork, she's coming down the hallway with her dad, about to give me a high five. And right before she's about to get to me, her dad grabs her wrist and says, "Wait, we don't know whose side he's on." And then
Wow.
pulls her out the door and into the parking lot. And I never saw her again.
Wow.
So that
Yeah.
night, they had sort of an emergency meeting. And by the end of that night, it became clear that the elders, even though they had the official leadership role of the church, that the senior pastor really was the spiritual leader of most of that congregation. And all of the elders had resigned by the end of that meeting. And within
Wow.
a couple of days, that senior pastor, who in the meantime had put some feelers out there saying, hey, things might not be working out, actually received a great job offer and took that job offer. And so within a couple weeks, it was like, there's no senior pastor, there's no elders. And with this non-denominational independent church,
Hmm.
there's really no chance for them to be able to support 2 pastors
Right.
moving forward. So I was kind of effectively laid off in that position, which was one thing, but also just saw an ugly but maybe real side of a
Right.
church that I wasn't at least prepared for, based on the training that we'd received in our Bible
Hmm.
college. Um, so went out to Phoenix and got another job in youth ministry, and a similar but not as intense situation happened with the church split there within about a year. And that was sort of it for me. It was kind of like I didn't want to get to 3 strikes and you're out. It was more like fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me. I don't think
Mm.
ministry is the thing for me. So
Wow.
I ended up finding a career path in the mortgage industry. And so this would have been 2005, 2006, real estate mortgages are booming. And like I had mentioned before, once my vocation was disconnected from my faith, there were some elements of my faith that were really sort of shaken from a lot of those experiences that kept shaking, I guess you could say, for the next several years.
Hmm. Yeah, those are pretty traumatic sounding experiences that you had. And so you mentioned earlier that you there have been points where you've been an avowed atheist too. Um,
Yeah, that hadn't happened yet. There was sort of one more big moment that happened after that, which was an emotional affair that I got involved in. This would have been in 2008, and
mm,
so I am feeling this personal and emotional connection with this woman who's not my wife, and it began, I don't want to say innocently enough, but it began with us sort of wishing that things could be better within our own marriages. And we're sending emails back and forth of, oh, wouldn't it be so great if she could be like this or if he could be like that, which then turns into us both thinking about, well, maybe you would be great as a spouse.
mm,
And I remember praying about it. And I remember feeling some sort of response saying, yes. Look at how alive you are right now. Zach, this is what I've called you to, is being alive. And you've been sleeping and I need you to wake up. And this is the path that I've created for you.
mm,
Things like that were sort of how I was interpreting my prayer life. And so I ended up listening to that and believing that, and leaving my family, and basically having what turned out to be about a 9-month full-blown affair, filed for divorce. Like I said, this is the new path, the new life that I'm supposed to be on. And when that relationship ran its course, which might be it, people are people are people. There's not a perfect spouse out there, maybe, for anybody. And some of the same challenges that maybe we saw in our previous spouses, we began to see in each other. And then
mm,
you kind of realize, maybe some of those things are actually in us that need to be fixed. And um, ended up returning to my now ex-wife, getting remarried, reconciling, but then having to put together this prayer challenge, or this prayer. I had to make sense of why I felt God led me to that, or
mm,
blessed that path. So either there's something wrong with God or there's something wrong with me. And I believed that there was something wrong with me. And I tried to return to my faith. And something just wasn't sticking with it. I couldn't shake the pain of not knowing if the response I would get from a prayer would be God or not. And so my
mm,
prayer life suffered, basically stopped existing. And I remember wanting to research what atheists had to say about faith. So this would have been probably 2011. And remember listening on audiobook to Richard Dawkins' The God Delusion.
yeah.
And I don't remember the specific passage or anything like that, but I remember hearing him say something that made me think, I wonder what it would be like to try on atheism. And I remember it
Mm,
felt like putting on a cloak. Like that was like the figurative trying on of atheism that I was doing. And as soon as it like clicked in my brain in a few different places, I couldn't take the cloak off. And
mm,
it solved some problems that I had theologically for a long time around evil, that I
Okay.
just could never totally square,
Right.
that put the responsibility for that on me and my fellow man. And like I said, I couldn't seem to take it off. That ended up having a deadly effect on our second marriage. And after sort of realizing that was the sort of new spiritual spot that I was at, she filed for divorce about a year later, and kind of found myself, divorced twice, without a religion, and without a career at that point either. And it's hard to be a pastor when you don't believe in God.
Although there are some.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, wow. Yeah, that's a lot. And you're a father during this
Yep.
time.
Yep. Father of three. In fact, my my final daughter was born just before that emotional affair had kind of happened.
When you got back with your wife, your ex-wife, were were you all attending church? Were you trying to bring the
Yeah.
kids up in church? Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. The kids were in a Christian context for Sundays, and also like in a Christian childcare setting as well. And
Okay.
it was more or less, back to usual for them. And even since then, my kids have all remained in the church, gotten baptized. Now we're however many years later, my son is actually a very devout Christian who's at a Christian college playing sports. A lot of the same. He's his own man. He's his own person,
Yeah.
obviously, but a lot of the same steps, that I was on.
Right.
Yeah, my kids are still very much in a Christian context. So and took it on personally as well. Like me, grew up in
Right.
that context, but then each of them at a certain time made that decision for themselves.
Right.
And so as our, custody, challenges have played out over the last decade, it really has been tough for me to kind of remain on the outside of that Christian context for most of their lives, actually.
Yeah.
And it's just been in the last 4 months or so that things have kind of opened up for me, to where I said I need a new mountain to climb. And when I
Yeah.
opened my mouth and started talking about church and who's at church, or what is behind church, if that's God, it opened up some really interesting opportunities to talk with mostly Christians, actually, about their faith in meaningful ways. And getting invited to pray for somebody else was probably one of the biggest um, turning points. And that's probably the right way to look at it, is if I was going this way away from God, I definitely felt some sort of spiritual turning back and turning towards whatever it was that animated so much of my life, and obviously in my kids' lives for the last, well, for all my life and almost all of theirs.
Yeah. So, like we'll circle back to that in a moment, what's happened in the last 4 months. But, as someone sort of, on Facebook, you sort of just keep tabs on people whenever you log on, you see somebody posts or not. And every now and then, so like, over the years, that's been some of the extent to which, I've seen what's going on with you, other than when we've crossed paths at various points. Um, something else I've also noticed, just like kind of from a distance, is they're never, from my perspective, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but like from where I sit, it never seemed like curiosity ceased within you. Like I would see you going to, like, I don't know, man camps, or like these various kind of camps and like experiences, sort of
Men's
just,
retreats, and yep.
yeah, men's retreats, like just seeking, I didn't know what you were seeking, but looking, searching, like, trying to find something, that the curiosity is still being there. And so, am I wrong about that? Am I
No,
right
no,
about
no,
that?
no. I think that is very accurate. And in fact, I've been really interested lately in the difference between, and it is, we may have to pick this up later, but the difference between the nuns, N-O-N-E-S, and the
Yeah.
duns. Like,
Yeah.
is there a difference between people who say, I've looked at everything, or I think I've looked at everything, or I've looked at as much as I can so far, and I'm choosing none of the above right now,
Right.
and the duns who are basically like, I know there's nothing out there for me, and I'm just done. I
Right.
definitely was more in that sort of none, but still sort of searching category.
Yeah. I could be wrong about this too, but I remember a post that's like lodged in my mind for some reason. I think where you were you were saying something about along the lines of like worship music, and you were like, wanting you're saying something like about how people sing passionately about worship music, and
Mm.
you wanted to be able to do that, but from like a non-believing
Mm.
perspective. Do you remember that, or
It sounds like something that I might have said and longed for,
yeah,
because I mean, really, if you can look at the history of the people who've tried to create sort of a church without God, or a religion that's not a religion, and
yeah,
it's been, in my opinion, almost exclusively failures. Like, it just
mm,
hasn't worked.
yeah,
There's a level of intensity that I felt when I was worshiping to something that I felt was receiving it in a personal way. And maybe that's
mm,
me anthropomorphizing, the mysterious God in some way, and I'm fooling myself. But the effect that it had on me and others, um, was just deeper and more intense than any other sort of,
right,
musical experiences that I've had. Um, so that it definitely sounds like something that I would have said and would have longed for. So it's like
yeah,
there's a God-shaped hole, and then there's, maybe some sort of like, there's like also just this sort of practical experience of God-shaped hole that I think we all have if we're either raised in tradition or deeply participate within a tradition.
mm. So what's happened in the last 4 months? I remember too seeing you walk past like some Orthodox church or something to that
Yeah.
effect, and like had some profound experience. So what's been going on, and it seems like this is sort of like open an entryway back for you to sort of circle back and begin re-exploring. So
Yeah,
let's
yeah.
talk about that.
Um, so within a lot of those, explorations and seeking, I would find different people who were turned out to be kind of thought leaders or philosophers, in some ways. Jordan Peterson and his sort of work on the Bible, like in like 2016, 2017, like his whole exploration of Genesis through a
Yeah,
psychological lens was
right.
extremely, like, so when I left sort of my faith, I had to sort of find something to fill that hole. And I went down the psychology path, and I got my
Right.
master's in organizational psychology, and a lot of, I taught psychology at a local private school and our local colleges. So it's like the whole language and world of psychology really sort of helped
Yeah.
in some ways to scratch that itch a little bit. But it was never quite all the way. And then about 4 months ago, and it was just after I had said I need another mountain to climb, and I turn on the camera and I talk about church. One of these philosophers that I had kind of followed became a Christian, and not just like in some sort of pragmatic way of like, well,
Mhm.
this makes a lot of sense because I'm politically motivated and I want to, do whatever. Like, he walked into a church and was like overcome with the pure beauty of the relationships between the people, the young people, the old people, and the God that they all identified with. And over time, he continued to explore that at a deep level, and became a Christian. And when I learned that news, it was like, here's all these smart people that I've been following and believe that they've got maybe some sort of closer sense to the truth than I do. This guy just basically said he found what I've been looking for back where I started. So why don't I look back there as well? And he's sharing this on a podcast that my wife and I are listening to together. And she usually just does not care about this stuff at all. Like if I'm listening to Jordan Peterson in the car, she's like, ugh,
Yeah.
this guy sounds like Kermit the Frog, turn it off. Even like the good Christian stuff, it's just not her jam.
Yeah.
But we're listening to this guy's name is Jordan Hall. Listen to him talk about his conversion experience. And she says to me, she said, you're going to talk to him. And I'm like, babe, he's kind of a big deal. He's at least a big deal to me. He doesn't know who I am. There's no way he would talk to me. But she knew that I looked up to him. She knew that if anybody would be able to sort of get through to me, he would be one of them. So I send him a tweet, or he tweets something out, and I respond to it. And I was like, hey, I'd actually love to talk to you about your conversion experience. And he said, I'll trade you for a bag of coffee. And that exchange turned into conversation on Riverside, what we're talking on right now. In one of my as actually ended up being the first full podcast conversation for my podcast, where I got to understand how he got there and started speaking our language of Christianese with him. And at the very end of that call, he asked me to pray for somebody. And it was so pure, and it was the only thing he wanted from me. It was like I had asked him for some time, and he asked for a bag of beans or whatever, I guess, kind of tongue in cheek. He does love coffee and he loved the beans, whatever. But like once we had sort of sunk into that more heart to heart level, he asked, like, will you pray for this person? And another thing had happened just a week before, which was weird. But do you know who Pete Rollins is?
Yeah. Yep.
So saw a tweet from Pete Rollins inviting people to give up atheism for Lent.
I remember that. I remember. Yeah, I remember that.
It's just such a weird thing that, I mean, it's hard not to laugh at it. But I was like, you know what? Why not? And so I actually made a commitment to my friends that I was going to give up atheism for Lent. And I didn't even know what that meant. I attended a church that Sunday for like the first time in a long time. But when someone asked you to pray, I didn't have the, pushback of saying, well, I don't pray. I said, wow, I guess I do pray. And so we ended the call. It wasn't one of these, let's like sort of pray together. It was not performative at all. So we ended the call and I just sat right here and prayed. And maybe it's because I was praying for someone and not just sort of selfishly for myself, hey, God, reveal yourself to me, show me the way, me, but it was for someone else. I really sort of felt that there was somebody listening on the other end. And it was just kind of a simple prayer of, God, let your light shine on this person. I didn't need to give specifics. I really trusted that whoever I was speaking to would know those specifics. And the purest thing that I could ask for, that I believed couldn't be wrong, was his light to shine on that person. And then immediately another person's name popped in and into my head, and I prayed for them. And I messaged Jordan back, and he started praying for that person as well. And then it's Lenten season, which our tradition, I don't know, did your church ever practice Lent, or mine didn't?
I didn't grow up in a church. I didn't become a believer or a Christian until right before my senior year of high school. My family, I'm still the only Christian in all of my family. Besides
that
my
church,
wife.
Was it even Lenten season at that point?
Yeah, the Christian church didn't, the Restoration Movement churches, they didn't ever celebrate Lent. I've been part of an Anglican movement that celebrated Lent, and Methodism, which celebrated Lent, and now Nazarenes, which depends where you end up. You might find people celebrating Lent or not.
Yeah. So fasting is something that I became aware, over time with Lent, especially we have a lot of Catholics in our community. They would fast on Fridays. And so I began fasting on Fridays through Lent as well. And so I had, without knowing really what I believed, other than that sort of big commitment of giving up atheism and these practices of prayer and fasting, um, I just became more open to like a God sort of moving, I guess, within the universe again. And I was walking with a friend, and I tell a longer version of this story in my podcast, so maybe I'll for
Yeah.
time just sort of cut to the chase. But this Greek Orthodox priest ends up inviting me into his church on a random Tuesday, and there's a service going on where there's two people sort of performing the service, and nobody else in the congregation except for me and my friend who he just invited in. And there's a lot of stained glass. There's a lot of pictures of Jesus. I've never been in an Orthodox church before. I've learned sort of since then about how they revere icons, and but there's a big stained glass Jesus in the front, and the priest is going around and he's swinging smoke around here, and like these guys are chanting Bible verses, and it's kind of weird, but
Yeah.
cool. And like I said, I'm open to things right now. I'm like, all right, God, is this what I need to do? Okay. And I end up locking eyes with this stained glass image of Jesus and feeling like I need to, I can't just maintain eye contact with the King of Kings. I need to kneel in front of this king. And a lot of the sort of men's weekend, men's retreat stuff that we would do, we would talk about the male archetypes and the king, warrior, magician, lover, like especially that king archetype. There's an appropriate way to embody that as a man and as a father, but there was also this king that I needed to kneel in front of. And I ended up even getting lower and like totally prostrate on the ground. And after about 5 minutes, I left and wondered what the heck happened. So I've had these weird things where my wife predicts that I'm going to talk to a guy, and then I do, and then a priest invites me into a church, and I feel the compulsion to bow down to a stained glass Jesus. And I did one other experience out in California where we visited John Mark Comer's church. It's actually not his church, but the one that he's been preaching at. It's in Santa Monica. I'm not remembering the name of it right now, but he lives nearby there, and he was sort of preaching through Lent, and found some of his stuff on YouTube, and have been sort of encouraged by how he approaches his faith, and worshiped there with my wife and my youngest daughter, like in like a genuine, like it was like a blast from the past. It was like, I am back. I am raising my hands. I am singing. I am praying. I am locked in on the sermon. And a guy at the service ends, and then we're walking out, and a guy from Evansville, it's like 2,000 miles away. I lost him. All right, we're still recording.
My internet connection. Keep going. You're worshiping.
Okay, we'll pick it back up. Your daughter may have to do a slight edit here, or maybe not. But we're worshiping, and then it ends, and it's just like we're just feeling it. Like my daughter said, she's like, this is so cool. Like I've always wanted to be able to do this with my dad, and like we just did it. My wife is so thankful. And then we're sort of kind of in the sort of mingling donut area out front. And this guy stops me and says, "Hey, are you Zach?" And I'm like, "Yeah." Like, "Zac Parsons?" "Yeah." Like, "From Evansville?" "Yeah." "You own Honeymoon Coffee?" "Yeah." It's like, "We go there all the time. We're visiting my daughter. I recognize your face from the podcast." And it was this guy from Evansville who also happened to be at the same church service, and it just felt like one of those things where if there's a theme in my story of like not knowing when God is speaking and when he's not, that was one of those sort of very clear, hey, you know what? I'm here. I'm with you. Here's a little, I don't know, a wink, nudge, pat on the back, whatever. That's how I interpreted it. So that was another sort of powerful moment with that. But now Lent has ended. The sort of, fun signs and wonders have kind of, worn off. And, I've got to try and figure out what my relationship with God is in a more mundane experience, day to day, week to week, month to month.
That's interesting.
That's where I'm at.
Yeah, it's interesting to hear that. I taught a class at the Christian University here a couple of years ago, maybe before COVID. I can't remember, but the title of the class was Signs and Wonders. It was just the whole class was supposed to be on that. And I had done some research leading up to that, some meticulous statistical analysis of Scripture, and I went through and I found every sort of thing that could be classified as a miracle or a sign or a wonder in Scripture. And I sort of tallied up all the verses, and I found that in the Old Testament, something like 5% of the verses are stories of signs, wonders, miracles. So I was doing this research, right? And I've essentially found that like 5%-ish, maybe 4% of Scripture details these what we call miracles, signs, wonders, which leaves us 95 to 96% of the Scripture just mundane, right? The day to day, and that was a big realization for me that really, all across Scripture, we sort of get enamored with these big events, the Exodus, the healings and so on and so forth. But really, if 95 to 96% of Scripture is just like God in the mundane, like somebody baking bread, getting water out of a well, like, journeying through the wilderness, these sorts of things, that God is there. And the story is trying to tell us that God is there more in the mundane, the day to day, than we realize. And something that's really helped me throughout the years, I have a sort of a deep and abiding appreciation and affinity for pockets of like Jesuit theology. And Saint Ignatius, like his stuff has really helped me think a lot about looking for the divine, looking for God in those mundane things, the day to day.
And you found it as well, found him in those?
Absolutely. So it's been this long process over the years where now I've been so trained in a way to look at just anything or any person or any event or situation, and sort of been conditioned or trained to see it, if nothing else, as a signpost, sort of pointing to God. And so, like, looking at something from a stoplight to a blade of grass to my neighbor's steps out the window here, or this ladder going up to the top of there, like, to be able to look at that and be like, yeah, that's a signpost that's pointing to God. Like, there's something totally divine being communicated in that mundane thing, in this mundane moment. And so it's interesting that you use that. That's like one of those, the word mundane has become like a bells and whistles, like a red flag word for me, right? As soon as I hear that, like, like, because that was a sort of tipping point moment for me, to get to that conclusion, like, and it's kind of changed everything,
And I feel like for me, I resonate with that a lot too. And as you can appreciate, as someone who's been married for a while, there are seasons with any relationship, but especially like a spousal relationship, where you're just like, I'm in this because I committed to it, and I don't feel like it. I do not feel like being the partner that they might think they deserve right now, or it is mundane. It is just it's boring. It's
Yeah.
day to day, and
Yeah.
it's not that sort of honeymoon energy. And I think part of the irony of us, naming our coffee shop, honeymoon, is that it's implied that it's this sort of short, brief, moment in time, at the beginning. It's that's the best. It's at the beginning, and then it's this slow diminishing
Mm.
returns after that. And what we have found is, as we focus on finding the meaning in those mundane times, and even creating meaning around,
Yeah.
for us specifically, like literally making coffee for each other every day. Like
Mm.
we have transformed that into a sacred act of love with each other. And it's my act of love towards her every night to weigh and grind the beans and prepare the filter and prepare the water. And it's her sacred act of love to me every morning to wake up before me and bring the coffee to me in bed.
Mm.
And like
Mm.
that is how we've approached our relationship. But this is a person that I can see and touch, and
Right.
and so I guess my work, my challenge, my call is, can I remember those moments to where I did feel some sort of clear call, clear connection with God, to keep my gaze upward, to keep
Mm.
my um it's less about belief, and it's more about just being, like
Mm.
being someone that is more godly and less me.
Yeah. And as I hear you like talking about that, I mean, if I were to sort of put that in religious terms, I'd say you guys have this ritual now,
Yeah.
right? Or even a sort of more close to home term, maybe a sort of liturgy,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Um,
We've talked about, is that the right term? Well, no, my wife and I haven't talked about that. That's not a term. That's a term you and I would sort of have
right.
fun with, and my pastor
Yeah.
friends would have fun with. But yeah, yeah. And so I think where I'm at now, and I don't know if we have time to go into it. You had mentioned your experience with the Anglican Church.
Yeah.
Um, is, do I, in the spot that I'm at now, and I've got this entrepreneurial spirit, and I've got this sort of, we talked about the TEDx, like it was part of like creating that, like I have this
Yeah.
sort of like starter sort of energy and mentality. Do I start something or join something? And there's
Hmm.
benefits either way.
Yeah.
Um, but I went to the Canterbury Cathedral a couple weeks ago, and attended Sunday services there. And I'd never been to an Anglican church before.
Hmm.
And Mike, I got to tell you, the feel, where you're like, there's words that kind of go through your mind, like the feeling and the word that I got was home.
Hmm.
I did not expect it. And it was a lot more high church. There's people in robes.
Yeah.
There's a female,
Right.
priest, and there's like a magic wand, and like there's a whole thing. But I'll tell you that the music, like, talking about, I wish I had music that meant something. The
Hmm.
music meant something to me.
Right.
The sermon
Hmm.
meant something to me. The guy was able to sort of communicate and connect on a level to where I was like, this is real. And
Hmm.
so when I was invited to take communion, they sort of say, if you're not a believer or whatever, don't do it. And I was like, no, I'm in. I
Hmm.
believe this right now.
Yeah.
I'm going to take this in and let sort of Christ, move through me in my body that way, by sort of taking him in. Um, so I don't know if that was just, I haven't been to an Anglican church in my community yet.
Hmm.
But I'm a little curious as to how the Anglicans sort of got on your radar, and you had mentioned some other
Yeah.
denominations as
Um,
well.
yeah. So when we moved to Hawaii, that's when I stepped away from the United Methodist Church, and the place I was working was a school. My colleagues there had kind of just started an Anglican church, and so we moved here. We didn't have any social network. We're out on this island in the middle of the Pacific. And that was these were people I was working with, seeing every day. It was like a really built-in community immediately. And so we started going to this Anglican church for about a year and a half, and it turns out that year and a half in was some really big theological red flags. But the rector, he ended up in a couple of really massive scandals, and I'll spare everybody the details of that. But that we got out just a couple months before those scandals. The doors blew open, and yeah. So I have a deep appreciation too for the Anglican Church, and that sort of soured my experience of it here. But again, like going back to liturgy, I love that, and like super meaningful. There's so much I resonate with in the Anglican movement, and I certainly would not be opposed to going back to an Anglican congregation at some point. But now I find myself pastoring in a Church of the Nazarene, and but yeah, that's sort of how I got in it, and yeah. I'm sort of an ecclesiastical kind of mutt. I've been in every, Pentecostal, Southern Baptist, Nazarene, Methodist, Anglican, like all over the map. Yeah.
Well, and I think that's something that definitely still resonates for me is this idea of if there is a God that is a God of all these people, and there's all these sort of expressions, we're doing our best to sort of create an expression and a way to remember and experience God and create liturgies that get people there reliably. You just have to look around the landscape of the world and say, sometimes we're getting it right, but we're definitely doing it differently. And that I think it's actually, if you're a seeker like me, and in some ways, there's some real benefit to being able to continue to be open to experiencing something like that from a different perspective and a different liturgy and a different tradition.
Well, absolutely. Even as as a Nazarene, we're sort of your low church evangelicals, your standard evangelical church. Nevertheless, at where I pastor, we've come up with a weekly liturgy that has sort of the way it breaks down is like it's broken into like 3 or 4 segments, and each segment of the liturgy starts with a prayer, contains an ancient Christian practice, has a scripture reading, and then a song, right? Like and then we cycle through that sort of process 4 times before we ever get to a sermon, or before a sermon's ever finished. But trying to reach back into the great tradition, the great church tradition, and really embrace liturgy. And there are things in Eastern Orthodoxy that I have, again, an appreciation for, and that other evangelicals would have a lot of trouble with coming to terms with. And so for me, I'm always on to this sort of theological exploration, even saying like, I appreciate Anglicanism and portions of like Jesuit theology and practice, and then Eastern Orthodox theology and practice. Like that would get a lot of evangelicals mad, or
I'm encouraged to kind of hear you say that, because I do feel like that was maybe what was instilled in us in our Bible college days of kind of like, prepare yourself for false teachers or false expressions of what we surely have right here at our church, at our school.
Sure.
And
Yeah, I mean, and I love the restoration movement. I'm indebted to it. I'm grateful to it. But that whole idea that we're just recovering the New Testament church and we've got it, we've got a corner on it. That's very fallacious, and not to mention sort of arrogant.
Yeah.
And so I do think there are wrong forms.
Sure.
Certainly Paul talks about in Galatians, people who preach a gospel that's really no gospel at all. So I do think that exists. But I I really like resonate too with what you're saying there, that you're put on guard for all
Mm,
that. Um, so for example, this is a really good example, like Eastern Orthodoxy,
okay.
right? The two things in that I'm like, that's beautiful. Why have Protestants and evangelicals like shunned this? It's like
Mm,
scriptural, it's biblical still. So like, for example, like asking a saint to pray, right?
mm,
And this is something that most evangelicals would be totally closed off to. But um, I have a Christian theology that says when a Christian dies, they don't really die; they're just sleeping, and they
mm,
will awake. They will raise. And you read Hebrews, and you realize, oh, those who've gone before me aren't really sleeping. There's a great cloud of witnesses that are
sure.
watching me run this race and fall on my face all the time. Yeah, but they're cheering for me, which means
Mm,
they're alive. And in
mm,
Mark 12, Jesus is saying Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob are still alive because God's the God of living, not the God of the dead. And so, um, if my neighbor's kids are sick, well, then why shouldn't I say, just like I'd ask you, Zach, would you pray for, my neighbor's kids? Why shouldn't I ask, hey, St. Jude, the patron saint of children, would you
mm,
please pray for my neighbor's kids? You're alive. You're a living believer. Why would you intercede? Like, why?
mm.
What's the problem with that? I just had an Eastern Orthodox friend on here. That podcast will go live soon. You should listen to that. Her name is
Okay.
Elka Speliopoulos. And she talks about her transition out of evangelicalism into Eastern Orthodox Syriac
Mm,
um, Orthodoxy. But she was telling me about icons. I'm asking her about, well, what's the deal with icons, and the way she put it was like kind of mind blowing for me. Right? She says, I used to be very against icons as an evangelical, but she says now as a woman, when I walk into like this Orthodox church that I'm a part of, I feel 1,000 more times affirmed. Even though there's not women up front, we have icons of women of the faith throughout church
mm,
history all around. And she says, when I think about icons, it's like, I have a picture of my kids in my wallet. And so if I go on a trip, every now and then I'll open that wallet and look longingly at that picture of my kids and, think about them and remember that, I want to see them and that I care about them. And she said the icons are the same thing. You know, our
mm.
loved ones, we're on this journey, and every now and then we need to open up that wallet and look at their picture and be reminded of where they were at certain points in church history and in the faith. That's a beautiful way to think about that. And it just brings down the defenses that sort of surround icons, like you're worshiping a graven image or something like that.
Yeah. Yeah.
um,
That's what pretty
yeah,
sure that's what our the church we grew up with would say at this point still.
but I think there's something, right, um to me, beautiful about that.
Mhm,
And why wouldn't we want to look at holy men and women throughout church history and be reminded of the wonderful things that they've done?
mhm.
And a lot of them suffered and gave their lives, and um yeah, we should be reminded of that. That's a great thing. But
I think your openness to God's movement is what allows you to appreciate that. You haven't put God in so tight of a box to say, I know how God works and I know how he's definitely not going to be able to work through this Orthodox experience. I think that is the space where I'm at again right now as I
yeah,
sort of try and face God, face the divine, um, and yet still need to kind of come to grips with that experience from, I guess now 16 years ago, however long it was that I sort of felt led to that emotional affair, and
mm,
I don't know what's going to happen next.
yeah,
It's a little bit freeing to start to believe that I'll never like land. Like this will always be a journey. This will always be a wrestling match. But it feels right and good to have sort of God at the focal point of where I'm trying to face, and to constantly just be waking up and say, am I still facing God? Am I facing what is good, what is true, what is beautiful? If not, where am I? I keep looking to my right because you talk about the Church of the Nazarene. Do you know this guy?
Oh yeah, I do. Yeah.
Is he in your church?
Maybe not for much longer.
Oh. It's I heard him on a podcast recently, and it was recorded a few years ago, and I was like, whoa, this guy is describing my sort of theological journey better than anybody. And so the whole idea of deconversion versus deconstruction, I didn't really like the deconstruction language for a long time. But I've now come to appreciate it, some more. And especially as whether I've reconverted or not, I'm definitely putting some of those pieces back together. So it helps me in the stage that I'm at right now. Like I said, adding prayer, adding fasting, looking to God. But it's this Thomas J. Ord is very interesting to me in sort of what I heard him say on that podcast, and I'm reading his book right now. So who knows? Maybe I'll end up in the Church of the Nazarene one of these days.
I don't know. We'll see.
We'll see if he's still there.
He's on trial right now.
My wife wants to join our podcast.
Yeah, that's all right.
Okay. Sounds like she didn't get the ride home that she thought she was going to get. So I'm her ride. So maybe we'll wrap up here in a sec.
Sure. Yeah, I was just saying he's on trial right now, and he's probably going to lose his credentials, and all that revolves around his perspectives, really, on human sexuality.
That's what I picked up on as well.
Yeah, there's some tension there, and there are other things like when I'll say this and we'll wrap up. Every Nazarene minister who's ordained, when one of the last questions they ask you is, do you promise to protect and serve the Church of the Nazarene for so long as you shall live? You say yes. And then right after that, they'll ask you a question like, if at any point you find yourself out of agreement or no longer believing what the doctrines of the Church of the Nazarenes, will you willingly surrender your credentials? And you have to say yes to be ordained.
Gotcha.
And so really the issue, while it has to do with homosexuality in Ord's case, is the real issue here is that his views have changed, and he hasn't been willing to surrender his credentials as he took the vow to do. Instead, he's staying and trying to change the denomination, and it's it's causing a lot of division and problems.
I can see that.
And from where I sit, so out of Bible college, I took a rural church, small rural church in Kentucky. And during that time, I was going to seminary and working on a master's degree. My views on women in ministry changed to the point where I think women should be able to do anything that men can do, and I think I can give a very strong scriptural argument for that. And it sort of came to a head on Mother's Day back in 2007. And after I preached that sermon, I had 3 or 4 of the elders and deacons corner me in the church foyer on the way out and said, "You ruined Mother's Day."
Because you affirmed women in that way?
So I said, we need to stop singling out mothers on Mother's Day. There's a lot of women in here who can't have children. There's a lot of women, mothers who are in prison and can't see their children. There's women in this congregation who've had abusive mothers. How about we just take today and affirm all the women in our congregation and lift them up? And I got cornered. The women were grateful for that. It's the men who took issue. And so they said, "You ruined Mother's Day." And I said, "Oh, is that right?" And they said, you just get up there and say whatever you want. And I said, well, right now I'm going to say whatever I want. And that's that by noon, you'll have my letter of resignation.
Wow.
So what
But
happened?
that's what you're sort of, that kind of seemed like what you were implying with this situation, which
So
maybe I shouldn't even say something publicly about it, something I'm so ignorant
no,
of, but it seems to follow what you're implying is like, if you find yourself out of line with what's expected, it's incumbent upon you to step
honor
down.
your vow.
Yeah.
Honor your vow. He's moved. We haven't,
Yeah.
so honor your vow. And that's really what it comes down to. We can make it all this distraction about human sexuality and LGBT or, whatever. But the real issue is the vow you took and not honoring it.
Mm.
You've moved. And so honor your vow. That's what I did back in 2007. I could have stayed, but I knew it would split that church right down the middle. And so the higher road was to move on. And that church, thankfully, is still intact today. And it's doing all right. It wouldn't be if I had stayed there and just made this the issue
Sure.
and drove it. So I wish Ord would honor his vow, surrender his credentials, and move on. I think it would be the noble and honorable thing to do. But yeah, so
it's tough because you just when there are just so many of those human relationships and things like you and I will always be connected to each other from those formative years, at our Bible college, and I can only assume the similar relationships that he has,
Right.
specifically within his denominational, history.
Yeah.
And it's got to be a really hard sort of thing to give up on your identity in that way, depending on how deeply he's held it. So
yeah. Well, man, it's good talking to you. I appreciate you sharing. Sorry for the couple drop connections along the way, but
well,
yeah,
we're going across the ocean here, so
it's always good talking
better
to
than it
you.
could have
Always good seeing you. And I hope at some level to be an ongoing conversation and dialogue partner with you.
Yeah.
You continue your search. So
I look forward to it. I know that you have really kind of doubled down on scripture and languages, and so I think that's been a stumbling block for me in the past. It's probably still a stumbling block for me at this point. And so maybe in the next few months we can sit down again and maybe have a focused conversation around how you've held scripture. And
I'd love that.
And that would probably actually be really helpful for me.
Yeah, I'd love that. Anytime, brother. Well,
Okay.
blessings to you and your wife and the 4 shops you're running and all of that.
Yeah, who knows what's been going on while I've been, here on the call. Well, I'll find out here in a second. But yeah, appreciate it and appreciate you. And this is great. We'll do it again.
Yeah. All right, friends. Hey, do you guys have a website, by the way, that we can plug?
Yeah. honeymooncoffeeco.com.
And your podcast, what's that?
Podcast, it's called the Honeymoon Coffee Podcast.
Okay.
That's our sort of company one, and then my personal project is it's called Zac Parsons Projects, and it's me sort of projecting meaning and my biases into these different areas of my spiritual journey, and it's mostly on YouTube. You can find it on YouTube. All right. There.
Well, friends, check those out. Check out glowshouse.com, the Glowshouse YouTube channel. We're going to wrap it up there. We'll stop there and say we hope that helps.
Interested in growing your ancient language skills but not sure where to start? Glowshouse can help. From illustrated readers and short stories to lexicons and grammars, Glowshouse offers a variety of resources for beginning, intermediate, and experienced ancient language learners. Head to glowshouse.com today. Glowshouse, language resources for the global community.